Okay, now I'm at the top of page 4. I know it's not on the screen right now, but if you're listening and following along in your text, then I will give you some notes. Make sure that you're paying attention to them. So, top of page 4 says, the soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. I have, he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. Paragraph 30. And did you really have 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. So she's feeling curious, and that's the note that I put there. I did, said Sergeant Major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Inquired the old lady. The first man had his 3 wishes, yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. So I'm going to stop you right there, and I put an annotation to say, I wonder why he wished for death as his third wish. But I also can make a connection here to the previous page when the guy was talking about those who interfered with it did so to their own sorrow. So I'm feeling like there's this bad omen about this monkey's paw, right? You can make some inferences in that. So then going on to the next paragraph, his tone was so grave, which means serious, that a hush fell upon the group. So I wonder what the serious tone is. It kind of almost feels like a little bit like doom, right? Paragraph 35. If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris, said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, so like a silly whim, I suppose, he said slowly. If you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly, would you have them? So to me, that was like an eager curiosity, and that's what I put there, is that the old man is really like interested to know, what would you have? Would you do it? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw and, dangling it between his front finger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. Well, gee, why would he do that? Why would he suddenly throw it into the fire? White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. So, Mr. and Mrs. White, remember that's their last name. So when it says White with a slight cry, it was like, oh my gosh, like they couldn't believe it, and they snatched it out of the fire. Paragraph 40. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. So it makes me wonder, what does he know about this? That's my annotation. I asked the question, what does he know? If you don't want it, Morris, said the old man, give it to me. And then it says, I won't, said the friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch, so it means to throw or to toss it. Pitch it on the fire again, like a sensible man. So to me, again, this feels like the third time in this where there is a warning that something is not quite right. The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major. But I warn you. So again, there's some foreshadowing in there. Now he's just outright saying, I warn you of the consequences. So paragraph 45 is at the top of page 5. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew his talisman from his pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. So the husband, the wife, and the son were like, oh, this is so great, and they're having a good time. And the sergeant major is not having the same sentiment. His tone is more of alarm and concern. So I underlined that. They're excited, he's concerned. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped it back into his pocket and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterwards the three sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey paw is not more truthful than those he's been telling us, said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train, we shan't make much out of it. So paragraph 50. Did you give him anything for it, Father? Inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. So, like, did you repay him? Did you give him anything for giving it to you? A trifle. So it means a little, said he, coloring slightly. He didn't want it. He's referencing like money. He didn't want it, but I made him take it. And he pressed me again to throw it away. So more foreshadowing. There's more warning. Just get rid of it. Don't keep it. Likely, said Herbert with pretended horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, Father, to begin with, and then you can't be henpecked. So you can hear the greed. Is it greed? Is it optimism for what could be? But you hear that in his voice. So there's two totally different moods or tones happening here from our characters. The sergeant major is warning and he's expressing tremendous concern, and the family is like, oh, this is going to be so wonderful. It's going to be life-changing. So let's keep going. He darted around the table, pursued by the malaligned Mrs. White, armed with an anti-macassar. Okay. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. So he's very doubtful. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. It seems to me that I've got all I want. So he's very content in life. If only you cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for 200 pounds then. That'll just do it. His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. I wished for 200 pounds, said the old man distinctly. So again, he told him, don't wish for too much, and here he is wishing for 200 pounds. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. It moved, he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wish it twisted in my hands like a snake. Paragraph 60. Well, I don't see the money, said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table, and I bet I never shall. So he's really doubtful, the son is. It must have been your fancy father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. Never mind, though. There's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same. And they sat down by the fire while the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. Okay, so maybe or maybe not, you might notice that the wind was higher than ever. So there was a change happening in their setting as well, in their environment. So I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert, as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe, watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. So there could be a key detail in there, and your ill-gotten gains. So it's dishonest, it's evil. Again, there's this warning of dread and doom to come. Paragraph 65. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. So he's feeling nervous now. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. So page 7. So then it says, in the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, Herbert laughed at his fears. So it's a new day. Nothing happened overnight, he thinks. Maybe things are okay. There was an air of prosaic. So at the bottom, I'm looking down there. It means it's common or ordinary. Wholesomeness about the room, which it had lacked on the previous night. And the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. I suppose all old soldiers are the same, said Mrs. White. The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could 200 pounds hurt you, father? Might drop on his head from the sky, said the frivolous Herbert. Morris said that things happen so naturally, said his father, that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence. Paragraph 70. Well, don't break into the money before I come back, said Herbert as he rose from the table. I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious, so meaning greedy man, and we shall have to disown you. So he's really joking here, Herbert the son is. There's no fear in his voice. His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity, all of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to the retired sergeant majors of Bibulus, that means fond, or his addiction to drinking, habits when she found that the post brought a tailor's bill. Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home, she said as they sat at dinner. I dare say, said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. But for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to. So there's curiosity and confusion in this now. You thought it did, said the old lady soothingly. Paragraph 75. I said it did, replied the other. There was no thought about it. I had just... What's the matter? His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movement of a man outside. So again, there's someone at the door, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the 200 pounds, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat in glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with a sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind her and hurriedly unfastening the string of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, so she's feeling uncomfortable because she calls him a stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into her room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. Then she waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. So it's talking about how impatient women may be able to be. And so she's really wanting him to hurry along. But I was asked to call, he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. And by the way, that doesn't mean a telephone call. That means I was asked to come here to you. I come from Ma and Megan's. The old lady started. Is anything the matter? She asked breathlessly. Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it? So now the old lady, Mrs. White, is worried. Paragraph 80. Her husband interposed. There, mother, he said hastily. Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've brought bad news, I'm sure, sir. He eyed the other wistfully. I'm sorry, began the visitor. Is he hurt? Demanded the mother. The visitor bestowed in assent. Badly hurt, he said quietly, but he is not in any pain. So right there, you can start to make a conclusion. If someone is badly hurt but not in any pain, what do you think happened? Oh, thank God, said the woman, clasping her hands. Thank God for that. Paragraph 85. She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath and, turning to her slower-witted husband, laid a trembling hand upon his. There was a long silence. He was caught in the machinery, said the visitor at length in a low voice. Caught in the machinery? Repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. Yes. He sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. He was the only one left to us, he said, turning gently to the visitor. It is hard. Paragraph 90. The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy to you in your great loss. So their son has died, he said, without looking round. I beg that you will understand that I am only the servant and merely obeying orders. There was no reply. The woman's face was white, her eyes staring and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend, the sergeant, might have carried into his first action. Remember, he was a soldier, so it was a look like that. I was to say that Ma and Megan's disclaim all responsibility. So they deny any responsibility, continued the other. They admit no liability at all. But in this consideration of your son's service, they wish to present you with a certain sum of compensation. So they're saying, it wasn't our fault, but we are going to give you some money to help support the situation. Mr. White dropped to his wife's hands and, raising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at the visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, how much? 200 pounds was the answer. Paragraph 95. Unconscious of the wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a slightless man, and dropped a senseless heap to the floor. So he's maybe aware of his actions. He's upset at the consequences of maybe what has happened because of that monkey's paw. Okay. And oops, let me continue with my slides here. I fell a little bit behind. So we're going to start section 3 now. In the huge new cemetery, so this is more looking at timing now. This is days later, right? So when we're thinking about text structure, we have jumped forward a little bit. Some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to a house steeped in a shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation as though something else to happen, something else which was to lighten the load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed. So again, we're noticing the timeline here. And expectation gave place to resignation. The hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long in weariness. So if you think about it, this is the husband and wife. They are so sad and disheartened by what's happened to their son. They hardly talk anymore. Everything is just miserable to them. It was about a week. So again, 3 paragraphs in a row where we're talking about a timeline here. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. So you should be on the top of page 10. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You will be cold." Paragraph 100. "It is colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. So the old lady, the mother, is so upset that she can't control her weeping. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. So now she has an idea. She wants that monkey's paw. "You've not destroyed it?" Paragraph 105. "It's in the parlor on the bracket," he replied, marveling why. She cried and laughed together and bending over, kissed his cheek. So now she's starting to feel excited. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've only had one." Paragraph 110. "Was not that enough?" he demanded fiercely. So he's got lots of worry. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly and wish for our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "Good God, you are mad!" he cried aghast. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly and wish. Oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you are saying." So he's feeling really nervous now and trying to warn the wife. 115. We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "A coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go and get it and wish," cried the old woman, quivering with excitement. Top of page 11. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook. He had been dead 10 days. So again, there's more timeline there. "And besides, I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?" So the old man had to go identify his son, and clearly the woman did not have to go in and see him. "Bring him back," cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?" Paragraph 120. He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlor and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat. Why was his brow cold with sweat? He was so worried. You can put that. He felt his way around the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in a small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he faltered. So again, more fear. "Wish!" repeated his wife. Paragraph 125. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank, trembling in a chair, as the old woman with burning eyes walked to the window and raised the blind. So why is she going to raise the blind? First, the sergeant major came to the door. Second, the man came to the door to tell him the bad news. So now she is going to that door to see maybe someone will come to the door and tell me good news, right? So she raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burnt below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. So the candle went out. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to bed. And a minute or two afterward, the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. So there's a lot of imagery that's starting to this that's alluding to time, right? So glancing occasionally, they're noticing that they had to turn the candle on. The candle went out over that time that the candle has gone out. They've been waiting for a little bit of time. Neither spoke, but both lay silently, listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time, screwing up his courage because he's nervous and he's trying not to be, the husband took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. Page 12 at the top. And so this is where my notes on your screen pick up. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out and he paused to strike another. And at the same moment, a knock, so quietly and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. So again, there's the third knock on the door. Paragraph 130. The matches fell from his hand. He stood motionless, his breath suspended, until the knock was repeated, and then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. This man is scared. Father, Mr. White, is nervous. He knows that probably nothing good is going to happen from him opening that door. "What's that?" cried the old woman, starting up. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up, listening in bed. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" And so she's feeling so super happy. Paragraph 135. She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm, he held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy! It's Herbert!" she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away." So that's where he works, 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let me go. I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. So he's got the fear. The old woman is excited and happy and optimistic that her son is coming back to her. "You're afraid of your own son," she cried, struggling. "Let me go." "I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming." Paragraph 140. There was another knock and another, and the old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the pocket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. She's hopeful and eager. "The bolt," she cried loudly. "Come down. I can't reach it." So she can't reach the bolt to let her son in, but her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. So I wonder, what is he looking for that paw for? What's he going to do? What's the reason he needs to have it? So he's feeling scared, but you could ask the question, what is he going to do with it? A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. Top of page 13. The knocking ceased suddenly. So first of all, I want to know what the heck his third and last wish were. But the knocking ceased suddenly. Although the echoes of it were still in the house, he heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp, flickering opposite, shone on a quiet and deserted road. So what just happened? So there was a wail of disappointment. So she was upset. Then they're outside. The street lamp is flickering. Why? What happened at the end of the story?